In the mountains of Appalachia, where fog crawls low through the valleys and cabins sink into the earth like they're trying to hide, there are stories people don't dare write down. Old men sitting on porches lower their voices when the subject comes up, and children are shooed indoors before they can hear too much. But if you stay long enough, if you buy enough coffee in the diner at the edge of town, someone might lean across the table and whisper it to you. They'll tell you of a woman, an aunt, who crossed a line no one outside the hollow could even imagine. She became a bride, not to a stranger, not to a distant cousin, but to her own blood. The wedding was not a celebration, not even a sin in their eyes. It was survival. It was obedience to an unspoken law that demanded, keep it in the family. The story begins in a weather-beaten cabin that still stands, though most travelers mistake it for an abandoned barn. Inside, generations gathered in silence. No church bells rang, no preacher spoke. Instead, a father muttered a blessing that sounded more like a curse, and a family of witnesses sat still, their eyes hollow, as a young man stood beside his own aunt. She trembled but did not protest. He stared at the floor, knowing the world outside those hills would never understand. No record exists of that night, no license, no ledger, no Bible entry. And yet, the story survived in whispers carried down through decades, that a family had sealed its fate in blood, and the hollow itself seemed to twist under the weight of their union. To this day, the trees lean in strange directions there, as though nature itself remembers what should have never been. Some say the woman's face still appears in the cabin's broken window, pale, drawn, her lips moving as if repeating vows no law would ever recognize. Others swear they've heard footsteps inside when the place should be empty. And though her story was meant to be forgotten, every echo insists otherwise. This was not just a wedding. It was the birth of a curse. The further you dig into this family's history, the more you realize how carefully it was buried. Courthouse clerks in rural Appalachia prided themselves on keeping thick ledgers, their pages filled with neat handwriting that tracked every marriage, birth, and death. But when researchers went searching for evidence of the aunt who became a bride, they found something strange. Blank spaces. A marriage entry that should have been there simply wasn't. Some insisted it had never been recorded at all. Others whispered the page had been ripped out, torn by someone desperate to erase a truth that would damn not just two people, but an entire bloodline. Neighbors remembered the silence more than the event itself. They said children from that ridge carried the same last name on both sides of their lineage. They said a daughter would appear in one census, only to be listed years later as a wife. Outsiders scoffed, thinking it was a clerical error, but those who lived closer knew better. The family tree was no tree at all. It was a circle, folding inward, each branch twisted back onto itself. Teachers noticed too. They tried enrolling the children, but the ages and relations never made sense. A girl might call her mother sister. A boy might call his father uncle, and when pressed, the adults in the cabin would only stare, offering no explanation. One teacher described the experience in her diary. They looked at me as if I were the fool, not them, as if the hollow had rules I could never understand. By the 1920s, whispers became harder to silence. The county doctor filed a private note about a boy born with a spine bent like a bow. Another physician wrote, "The blood is too close." But these records rarely made it to public files. Many were burned in courthouse fires, lost in floods, or mysteriously vanished after being written. The land itself seemed to conspire with the family's secret. Travelers swore that whenever they approached the ridge, fog would roll down heavy, swallowing the path. Lanterns would flicker. Sometimes they saw faces peering from the dark windows of the cabin, pale, hollow-eyed children watching silently until the intruders left. Still, the whispers refused to die. A farmer who hunted near the hollow told of hearing strange voices at night. Not hymns, not songs, but a kind of droning chant. Low, repetitive, almost ritualistic. Another neighbor swore he saw figures moving in the woods, carrying lanterns at midnight, their light weaving between the trees like fireflies. When asked why no one reported it, locals shrugged. "It's mountain ways," they said. "Don't go looking where you don't belong." But some did look, and what they found made them believe the story was more than just rumor. In a dusty attic, a family Bible was discovered with its marriage, pages ripped clean out. In another, a single loose scrap was tucked between the Psalms. The writing was shaky, but the words clear enough. "She is my niece, and now she is my wife. God forgive us, but blood is all we have." It was never signed. No date, no names. But in a hollow where silence reigned, even that fragment was enough. The aunt who became a bride had lived, had wed, and had left behind not just descendants, but a shadow that lingered on every page missing from the county's history. The deeper you go into this family, the harder it is to tell where ritual ends and cruelty begins. What began as closed doors and muttered excuses turned over decades into a system that manufactured silence and bred tragedy. Neighbors who lived near the hollow remember the children first as a pattern, the same blank stare, the same thin hair, the same small, fragile bodies moving like echoes of one another. Teachers recorded what they could not publish. Pupils who arrived at school already muted, who would sit for hours without answering, who learned only to echo, prayers and simple chores. Midwives kept private notebooks in which dates and symptoms blurred, premature births, infants who failed to thrive, mothers who grew gaunt between pregnancies. Doctors who visited wrote clinical lines on slips of paper, developmental delay, congenital defects consistent with close kinship, recurrent neonatal mortality, and then folded the papers into drawers they did not open again, the family Bible. When it resurfaced in bits, read like a map of repetition. Names recycled, marriages circled, generations looping back on themselves. Where an outsider would expect a branching family tree, the ledger revealed a closed ring, a lineage that doubled, and then doubled again into itself. Children born into that ring were not simply related by blood. They were trained into silence from their first waking moments. A neighbor who tried to be helpful once left a loaf of bread on the porch and watched from the lane as 4 children appeared at the doorway in a neat line and did not move until a hand from within signaled permission. One of them reached for the bread with a slow, mechanical motion as if the act required authorization from a remote source. Those small performances were the public face of private enforcement. Inside the homes, the elders rehearsed what the children must become. Obedient, uncomplaining, ready to occupy the roles the family had assigned them before they could speak their own names. The assignments were cruelly simple. Preserve the line, marry within, accept the arrangement. Refusal was not spoken of, but it had known consequences. There are accounts, told in fragments by men now old and ashamed, of attempted escapes that ended in quiet burials or sudden absences. A girl who fled to the county seat vanished without a trace a week later. Her mother, when asked, only shook her head and warned against stirring trouble. Those who tried to intervene from outside found obstruction in subtle forms: burned files, missing ledger pages, and a community's refusal to press the matter, for fear of the shame that named the crime. The county clerk who first flagged the pattern later confessed that certain entries ought not be written down, and then resisted access to the boxes historians later wanted to inspect. Even the law, when it came close, often stepped back, confounded by kinship lines that read like riddles. When a sheriff once drove up the rutted road, he found the porch empty and the wind pushing nailed curtains against dark windows. He heard, from somewhere inside, the low murmur of a hymn that did not sound like any church he'd known. He left with a report that read, "No crime apparent, family private." That privacy allowed their structures of control to calcify into doctrine. Elders began to speak of the blood as a sacred thing, a kind of purity that required vigilance to maintain. They learned to wrap their practices in biblical language and local custom until outsiders found it harder to accuse than to turn away. In that atmosphere, the physical consequences of generations of inward marriages accumulated like sediment. Doctors who dared to speak of what they had seen used scientific terms to mask horror. Increased recessive traits, higher infant mortality, phenotypic abnormalities. But those phrases do not capture the human cost. The children who never learned to smile. The mothers whose pregnancies, house after house, left them thinning and old before their time. One midwife who fled the hollow carried with her a single ragged photograph of a child with a bowed spine and hands that would not open fully. She refused to tell where she had taken the photo. She only said, "I could not stand it there anymore." Other witnesses described scenes that read like catalogues of neglect. Rooms smelled of stale air and wet clothing. Beds were shared by several people in a way that robbed infants of warmth and mothers of rest. Food was meager and medicine rarer. Still, there were nights when the village heard thin, high cries that stopped abruptly, as if hands had been applied to mouths. Some of the families kept elaborate lists of eligible children and used those lists to make matches, sometimes when the young people were still not old enough to consent in any meaningful way. Consent, in a place organized around preservation of a line, was not a concept that carried weight. The psychology of the household turned obedience into piety. Children were taught that the bloodline's survival was more important than their own comfort, that privacy was a virtue and outsiders were corrupters. The younger ones repeated the older phrases until the words and the belief were indistinguishable. That training hardened into compliance that sometimes looked like devotion. Stories persisted of ritualized dinners where elders raised heads and declared the family chosen, and the children would bow their heads and agree. One old hymnal discovered in a burned and hidden chest contained handwritten verses about keeping the circle and guarding the seed, penned in a trembling yet resolute hand. But ritual cannot erase observation. Teachers who recorded attendance noticed patterns. A child labeled daughter, 1 year appearing as wife in another ledger. Census enumerator once scratched unclear relation next to a household and stole his way out of the hollow with hands that would not stop shaking for days. The local school's headmistress kept a private diary with entries that read like a slow unpeeling of truth. They come as children and are returned as brides. The ministers look away. Sometimes, the horror took the form of violence. A neighbor who tried to save a runaway boy came back from the hill with his coat torn and his hat missing and a look he would never shed. He said nothing at the coroner's questioning, but later admitted he had been warned by men with faces like carved wood that the family would do what they must to keep safe. Those threats, seldom written down, kept many from acting. When inspectors did push, the family found ways to erase traces. They burned pages, moved graves, bribed or bullied witnesses into silence. There were fires that consumed birth records, and garages where trunks were loaded at night and driven away into the deeper woods. Some say the community protected the family out of fear. Others say protection came from pity, twisted into complicit silence. An unwillingness to confront the fact that neighbors had allowed a wrong to fester. Perhaps both were true. The longer the pattern repeated, the more the line bore marks on its body. Children's faces, to those who had seen them over decades, began to form a portrait. The same cheekbones, the same empty gaze. Those who carried the likenesses married those who carried the likenesses, and the features entrenched themselves as if the family had stamped itself into flesh. Genealogists who later traced the branches found loops impossible to reconcile. Documents that might have explained the relationships were missing, pages deliberately removed, signatures smeared as though to conceal more than names. When physical evidence could not be destroyed, it was hidden, graves dug shallow and covered with brush, charred photographs tucked behind false walls, a Bible, burned and then saved in piecemeal, and yet memory resisted obliteration. Old-timers told the same stories in different words, enough overlapping detail to form a coherent horror. Mothers who bore their sisters' children, girls married before they reached their teens, infants who never cried and were buried without markers. These recollections, when gathered, formed a chorus that historians could not ignore. Even after the family's compound collapsed and the cabins fell into rot, the echoes persisted. Hunters sometimes turned up small graves with no names and bones that told the same story doctors had feared for decades. Hikers reported glimpses of pale faces watching from the tree line, disappearing when approached. DNA studies conducted decades later revealed what the eyes and diaries had always whispered: unusual concentrations of shared markers amongst descendants traced to a single ridge. Those results did not vindicate or condemn. They only confirmed the arithmetic of isolation and the biological consequences of repeated close-kin unions. But numbers cannot name the sorrow. They cannot repair lives interrupted or count the grief of mothers who buried children with no stone. They cannot ease the memory of those who escaped and carried shame like a ticker tape down the long road away from the hollow. What remains is a landscape of absence, shuttered windows, rotted porches, cemeteries that the climb of brambles nearly hides, and beneath that quiet, the history of a family that made choice into ritual and cruelty into tradition keeps speaking, refusing to be blamed on coincidence or misfortune. It is a story rooted in control, sustained by silence and sealed by the sad arithmetic of closed circles. If you listen closely on a windless night, the hollow still seems to murmur the names of the children who were born into a fate they did not choose. When the last cabin collapsed under its own rot, the ridge seemed to sigh in relief. Yet the silence that followed was not peace. It was the heavy quiet of a place that remembers more than it wants to hold. Travelers who wander there today speak of an unease that clings to the skin, as if the hollow itself does not welcome strangers, only tolerates them until they leave. The structures are mostly gone, roofs caved in, chimneys leaning like crooked gravestones. But the earth has its own archive. Dig near the foundations, and you will find rusted locks, shards of jars, and sometimes fragments of letters that were never meant to be found. One, half-burned, contained a line that chilled even hardened archivists. Keep the circle closed, for only in silence is the blood made strong. But silence has limits, and when generations of secrecy unravel, what remains are scars. The descendants who fled the hollow carried those scars in ways less visible than bowed spines or vacant stares. They carried them in voices that faltered when asked about their past, in families that refused to hang photographs, in men who drank themselves to sleep each night because the songs of their childhood still crawled into their ears unbidden. The most haunting accounts are not of the visible deformities or the whispered rituals, but of the emptiness left behind. Teachers who later confessed they had done nothing to help their students spoke of dreams that would not let them go. Rows of children sitting perfectly still in classrooms, eyes unfocused, mouths sewn shut by something stronger than thread. Midwives who left the hollow but lived to old age reported that every time they held their own grandchildren, they feared the child would stop breathing because so many in the ridge had. The land itself began to resist. Fires that spread too fast, rains that turned the paths to mudslides, winds that stripped roofs clean from cabins. Superstitious neighbors said it was the ridge spitting out what was unholy. Scientists today might say poor building, erosion, bad luck. Yet anyone who stands at the site of the old homestead admits the same thing. It feels wrong to linger, even the graves refuse rest. Some are marked, but the markers lean at impossible angles, inscriptions faded as though scrubbed by unseen hands. Others are unmarked, scattered in patterns that make little sense, as if the family buried its shame wherever the earth opened easily. One grave, exhumed by accident during a logging project, revealed bones of 2 infants laid head to foot in a single box. The coroner, hardened by decades of work, recorded only 3 words in the margin of his notes. This is unnatural. What haunts most is not the cruelty alone, but the endurance of belief. For even as the family dwindled, even as neighbors whispered and officials pressed, the elders clung to their story. That purity was protection, that outsiders were corruption, that the circle must not be broken. They passed this creed to children who did not understand its weight until it was too late to escape. The last known survivor of the Hollow died in a care home in the 1980s. She was 92 years old, and her mind had long since retreated into muttering fragments of scripture and half-sung hymns. When an interviewer asked her about her family, she turned her face to the wall and said, "The circle is closed. Leave it buried." Those were her final recorded words. But history does not stay buried. The Hollow is mapped now, its story written in county records, doctoral theses, and whispered tours given by locals eager to frighten curious travelers. Yet no matter how many words are printed, no matter how many documentaries unravel the threads, there remains a core of horror that language cannot contain. It is the horror of children erased into silence, of generations that never had a chance to become anything but echoes of their elders' mistakes. Stand there today and you will feel it. The air is too still, as if listening. The woods grow dense, too quickly, as though trying to hide what lies beneath. Step too close to the foundation stones, and you may hear, or think you hear, the shuffle of bare feet across rotting boards. Locals will tell you not to stay after dark. They say, the ridge does not like reminders. They say it knows who belongs and who does not. Perhaps the most terrifying thought is not that these tragedies happened in a forgotten hollow, but that they are not isolated. Every region holds secrets. Every family guards its shame. The Hollow simply lived its sin so openly, so relentlessly that the land itself became saturated with it. And while the cabins crumble and the records burn, the blood carries on, scattered now, diffused into distant towns, into people who may not even know what shadows they carry. The story ends not with fire or law or revelation, but with a question left hanging in the air of Appalachia. When silence is inherited, how many generations does it take to break a curse? Until someone answers, the ridge waits, patient and watchful, its haunting unfinished.